Great. Well, thanks everybody for coming. This is a project, we completed the excavations a while ago, but it's a project where it's a work in progress. It's actually a manuscript that we're working on so I'd love to hear some of your input at the end of it on how we're approaching it and kind of if any of it makes sense. First of all, though, I want to talk about this. Supposedly the pro seminar is for students to learn about the faculty and what the faculty do. And so I thought I'd start with my early years. I am not one of those kids who grew up wanting to be an archaeologist. I went to CU and my degree is actually in journalism. I wanted to be a sports reporter. So I worked for many years at the sports information department. I really wanted to cover football. That's my go-to sport. Now it's hockey, but it was my go-to sport. But unfortunately, a little bit too early. Women were not allowed in the locker rooms at the time that I was going to school. I covered a lot of swimming. So in the middle of this, my work at CU, I needed a summer job. And a friend of mine was in a class that I was taking and said, you know, you should go. I got this job doing archaeology. He was an anthro major and said, you should come out here. And so I started doing summer field work. And I took a class, which is why I think teaching is so important. I took a anthropology class and I thought, this is amazing. So there I am working on Wyoming pipelines. We were excavating, we were surveying all through Wyoming, and that is my friend Dudley who taught me how to do archaeology. So the long-standing view of how important mentorship is and fieldwork. And so how I got to the Mimbres area was, I joke about it, I'm going through time. We as archaeologists look backward through time. My career has gone forward through time. My dissertation was on the adoption of agriculture by archaic populations. Then I got asked to work on a project at Lake Roberts, which is in the Mimbres Valley. It was my foot in the door into the Mimbres Valley. It's a pit house period site with a kiva, so I got really interested in community, which you'll see in a minute. And then eventually spent 8 years working at a large pit house village called the Harris site in the Mimbres Valley itself. Which is in southwestern New Mexico. And then after we finished at Harris, I was asked by the Forest Service to come and work at Elk Ridge, which is a pueblo period. So I figured that if I was going to stay in the career long enough, I'd be digging historic sites next, because I'm just going up through time. So this is the Mimbres Valley. I don't know how many of you are familiar with it. This is the site of Galaz. You don't see anything there because it was completely bulldozed, really, really heavily looted. Looting is a huge issue in the Mimbres Valley, in part because they make this incredibly beautiful, these incredibly beautiful ceramics. I don't like ceramics. Sorry, Karen knows it. But I have come kicking and screaming into the ceramic world because of working in the Mimbres Valley. So this is the Harris site. This is the large pit house village that I excavated for 8 years. And while I was working there, we got really interested in how the community developed. We had 20 pit houses, and then we dug a kiva, a large great kiva communal structure. And so I really got interested in how households were organized, how that changed through time, and then how communities were organized. So the next thing that happened is I got asked by the Forest Service to dig this small area of Elk Ridge. Elk Ridge, as we think about a 200-row pueblo, buried under alluvium, but you can see this arroyo here. It was starting to cut through this portion of the pueblo and erode some burials. And so the Forest Service said, would you come in and basically do salvage work here? And we did it with UNLV field schools for 4 seasons. This southern part has a very sad history. As I say, the site covers this whole area. The southern part of the site was completely protected because it is on an alluvial surface by the alluvium until 1989. Right after the passage of New Mexico state burial law, which was going to prohibit excavating burials, and that's where you find those beautiful pots. The landowner of that part of the site bulldozed. Thankfully, the Pueblo rooms were so deeply buried in this portion of the site that there's still a lot intact. He got quite a few rooms, about 40 rooms, but there's still a huge amount that's intact. And now that whole section is owned and protected by the Archaeological Conservancy. So we're very happy about that. So why they contacted me was they said, oh, look, the portions of the Pueblo are starting to erode into this arroyo. Would you come out and do some work here? And I said, sure. And I'm looking at that thinking, oh, that's not bad. And then they're like, oh, by the way, Barb, we need you to go. This is the fence line that marked the Forest Service from the private land. We need you to go to that fence line. I'm like, well, that's a lot of work. So 4 seasons later, we started. I was so happy because I did not know Pueblo archaeology that well. I've been digging pit houses for most of my career in the Mimbres Valley. They have a co-director. This is Dr. Daryl Creel from he was at that time at University of Texas. And so he was the co-director of this project. We had a project bioarchaeologist, that's Dr. Katie Bastian, and my long-term collaborator, Marilyn Marco, who does the public programs for the whole Mimbres Valley, has, I think, personally helped prevent looting across the Mimbres area. What we would do is each season we would dig along the arroyo, and then the Forest Service would come in afterwards and put these gabions in there so there was no more erosion. And I was just there. Magion conference was in October. I was there at Elk Ridge and it looks great. You can't tell. There's no more erosion. It's very well protected now. So we were very excited. So this is what we did. We worked along the arroyo and we excavated a number of Pueblo rooms, and I'm going to talk about some of what we found there. So during our excavations, we realized a couple things, and this is where the work in progress is. We had the Elk Ridge site, which is a large Pueblo, northernmost Pueblo in the Mimbres Valley proper, and then we had this kind of evidence of inter-community development. So we got really interested in that. But then the more work we did, the more I realized that Elk Ridge was part of this much broader local community. And so that's where we're trying to parse that out. And then, of course, on top of that, the Elk Ridge Pueblo was part of this Mimbres community and this Mimbres identity. So the location of Elk Ridge is really interesting because most of the big Mimbres Pueblos are south here along the main channel of the river. If you look here at this is the main channel of the river, it's not there. It's off to the side of it, not along the main river here. Here's the main channel, it's called the North Fork, but it's right near the confluence of what we call the Three Forks. Okay, what we think is a very important area because even though it's north, even though if it is the largest Pueblo in this whole area of watershed, okay? So that's why we think it developed where it was. There's also a large spring, freshwater spring next to it that would have provided ample water. But one of the things when I talk about the local community, we've done some work at a site called Cottonwood, right down here, 100-room Pueblo. And so one of the things we're trying to figure out is what's the relationship between these sites and this community. And Cottonwood is located so that it really did have control of, we think, the head gates for the irrigation networks for that, the south reach of this. So we started looking at these sites and what was going on with them, and we said, okay, you know, how do we fit this Elk Ridge community in here? So I'm going to talk about the actual intra-community. We'll talk about each of those levels in order. So Elk Ridge is a little bit different than many of the southern pueblos. A lot of the southern pueblos, there were large pit house villages, and then they built large pueblos right on top of them, okay? And so you have this long-term continuity. I've decided that that's what happens to me in my career. I work at sites that we can't really explain everything because they don't follow the trajectory. Because the Harris site, that pit house village I showed you, is the largest pit house village in the central portion of the Mimbres Valley, no pueblo on it. So I've spent much of my career trying to explain why there's no pueblo on top of Harris. There is a pit house village underneath Elk Ridge. We know that. But there's also a huge pit house village up on a ridge. Let me go back for just a second. Right up here above Elk Ridge, there's a huge pit house village. And that's where we think the local community began. That it started in the pit house period. So around 500 up until about 800, 850, AD 850. This is where those folks were living. And we think it's because that way they could see the north, they could control both the north side, that main channel from that area, and this side. So we're still not sure exactly, because everything's so deeply buried, exactly when they moved down. But at some time around 850, between 850 and 900, they moved down and built a huge pit house village at Elk Ridge. And that became the local community. We found in our excavations, we were so excited because one of the issues is, do you really have the pit house to Pueblo transition? What does it look like? We found it. I know you don't get to usually say that, right? But we actually found the pit house. So this is a late, what we would call a transitional phase pit house dating to the mid 950s, about AD 950. And you'll see, and Elk Ridge is a mess. I will tell you that. I'm going to talk a lot about that. But you'll see there are some nice adobe walls here. But notice how messy this is. They built an adobe pueblo on top of this pit house using two of the pit house walls. So we literally have the transition from pit house to pueblo right there. So we were very excited about that. And so we're like, okay, we do have the, and at the south end, they had done some salvage work at the south end after it was bulldozed. They found a large great kiva or communal structure that we think served this pit house period community. But then sometime in the AD 1000s, they began to build above ground Pueblo architecture. And one of the cool things that we found at Elk Ridge, this is an adobe Pueblo, and you can always see the ever-present arroyo, an adobe Pueblo room, and then an attached storeroom. And again, this is the one that was built above that late pit house structure. And it's the earliest Pueblo component. Because of the way the Pueblos have been excavated in the south, they had never seen this pit house adobe Pueblo component before. And we found it across that whole portion of the site. So we can really see the building of the community. Eventually, we have excavated a large number of rooms, and we've developed the sequence of occupation of these rooms. But this I want to highlight. So this is the Pueblo, the pit house, the Pueblo built above it, and then it was remodeled into a ramada. So it looks like whenever you see these maps, you're always like, oh, it's so nice. These nice pueblos. They are, if you work in the ancestral Puebloan Anasazi area, they are. They're nice and neat and square and perfect. And that's not the Mimbres. The Mimbres were so messy. And so you see this and you're thinking, oh, look at the nice rooms and the nice hearth. But you'll notice that that room is superimposed. There was a superimposed room over that room. So we hit one room and we hit another room. And during all the courses of that, they're remodeling. So they have doorways that they close, and then they build vents, and then they open them, and then they throw another wall in there to partition. So extremely, I told one day when I was really frustrated, when I was actually digging that pit house, and then that area had been remodeled into a ramada, and I was like, okay, I'm not going to work in the Mimbres anymore. I'm going to go next time. I'm going to go to work on a unit pueblo in northern Colorado. I'm going to go work at a unit pueblo where I can actually dig the pueblo, and I can say this is where the trash deposit is going to be, and this, because we were just constantly like, do you think was this a door that turned into a vent? No, I think it's a vent that turned into a door. So thank goodness we were able to map everything, photograph everything, and really work to try to reconstruct this. And you can see that they would like build different walls and it was a mess. But we think we figured out most of it now. And then you have the arroyo. So here's my favorite room. This is the first room we dug. This was when I went, oh my God, what have I gotten into? So 15 burials in this room. You can see where the arroyo had cut. You can see that was a door, and we excavated the room behind it. I'm going to talk about that room. It becomes very important in a minute. But you can see this wall. They like repaired it, and then they put a vent in, and then there was another room over here. And so trying to parse this out, I thought we don't need to look at the rest of the community. We're going to spend the rest of my career looking at what is going on in this room. But fortunately, through good maps, good photographs, good recordings, we've been able to kind of look at that intra-site development. So one of the things that we've seen is that we have what we call these core households. And that's not our term. It's a term that Harry Schaefer developed at Neon Ranch, which is in the southern valley. And looking at the important role of extended family corporate groups. Why are these so important? Because they're the landowners. They're the initial landowners. These core households move in, develop, and that's why we see so much remodeling and rebuilding. These are those long-standing land-holding families. That's why they're burying all their folks in the rooms, because it's like, my ancestors are here, and this is showing you this. So the other thing that we've really seen then in looking at this, because we have the pit house to Pueblo transition, is that transition was a lot about social issues. A lot about extended family, land tenure, things like that. Not just environmental, which is what it used to be. The agricultural intensification, sedentism, yes, important, but as part of the why it's important is because what happens with households and with these core households and how that relates to how the Pueblo grew. So what we see is obviously as a result of this, that we've got pretty big complexity in how the Pueblo grew. The largest rooms that we have multiple burials, all ages, buried over long periods of time. That suggests to us these are long-standing families. And again, Harry Schaefer was the first to note that he called them lineage rooms, and we've certainly got them at Elk Ridge, even in the small portion of the pueblo that we excavated. So we've further established in terms of the internal dynamics of the community, how important those households were. And we see a lot of changes through time in how they grew, and people moved in, people moved out. I'm going to talk a little bit about people moving in. And then we think that they were integrated through a variety of methods. There was, we found at the south end of the site, they excavated a classic period kiva, a pueblo period kiva. So we know that they were using kivas. We know from the remote sensing we did that there are large open areas that we're inferring were our plazas, which is a very common way. That's where usually you have village-wide feasts and village-wide dances, things like that. And so here's one. Today it doesn't look like much, but one of our inferred plazas. And then we also have evidence of some feasting activities. This was that, remember I talked about the remodeled ramada? We have this big ramada here. And it burned. There was a rock lined pit, and we found all these real. So it was you had the pit area. We found all these really big vessels around it, big serving bowls, and this is one of them. And it's got a very distinct iconography. This is called the goggle. We called it Gumby, but that's why I have the Gumby in my lab. But it's actually the goggle-eyed motif is very, very common in that area and usually associated with ritual. And so we find it on rock art. We find it on different kinds of iconography. They have in the caves there. They found this one. I should get a picture, put it on. It's like a tabular wood with goggle-eye that Miles Miller, a friend of ours who works in southeastern New Mexico, he C14 dated that tablet, and it was AD 650. So we know this motif has been long-standing, important in rituals in the Mimbres area, and we have it on this giant serving vessel in our ramada. So we think feasting was probably also a very important way to integrate these Pueblo occupants. So we've got the Pueblo. We think we know at least what was going on in the Pueblo. And we were like, okay, and this is where the work in progress is what does the local community look like? We're in the northern part of the valley. It's the largest pueblo in the northern part of the valley. Then the valley takes off going that way. And it's like, what was Elk Ridge? What was its role here? And we especially got interested in that when we started working at that site. I said that's just down toward on the main stem. 100-room pueblo, and we started working there in 2019. We were out there, and we did a bunch of reference collection, documenting. It's heavily looted, documenting the different room blocks there. We've got 4 room blocks there, and we figured out that initially I thought it was a 50-room pueblo, which fit in with that local community, right? Like, okay, it's just the next order down, but it's about between 100 and 120 rooms. But it doesn't exhibit. First of all, there's no pit house village underneath it, so it's either an offshoot of Elk Ridge or was built at the time that the pueblo was being built. There's not an earlier pit house component. The other thing is it doesn't exhibit that complexity that we see at Elk Ridge. We don't have the evidence of the remodeling and the reuse that we see at Elk Ridge. And so we think that this was a community that came with strong ties to Elk Ridge, and I'm going to talk about those ties in a minute, that came as a result of controlling this part of the river. This is a map that Peckham did in 1969. He did not record Elk Ridge. We put that on there. He didn't record Elk Ridge. We couldn't see it. And so he thought, his big thing was, there aren't any big pueblos up here. This is the closest one that we have. So this must have been the major pueblo. But now we're seeing, it's only a mile away from Elk Ridge, but it would have, if you were gonna irrigate and control an area of agricultural land, be nice to have a pueblo there, not just on the other side. So we think that they work together. And here's one of the reasons, it's not just location, but here's one of the reasons why. So these are two jars that were ritually retired. And what I mean by ritually retired is one of the things that the folks at Elk Ridge would do is they would smash vessels and they would leave vessel caches. So caches of vessels on floors, okay? And it was only in the big kind of corporate group rooms that we found this evidence of this ritual activity. But this is a jar that was smashed. And there were two of them. They were in different parts of different rooms. So we could, it's one of the ways we used to link these households, okay? Well, they were clearly, if you look at the motifs, and my graduate student, Danielle Romero, did this for her PhD dissertation. She did a lot of this work. You remember this, Yvonne? And so they were clearly made by the same potter, okay? So one potter making these very distinct jars, okay? Well, lo and behold, one of them in Elk Ridge room 117, so in the Elk Ridge Pueblo, made by a potter that clearly was the same as this one, sourced to cottonwood. And the other, also in Elk Ridge room 117, made by the same potter, sourced to Elk Ridge. So they were able to, they were obviously sharing clay sources. And we have other ceramic similarities from the two sites. We've done a bunch, Danny has done a bunch of INAA. Most of the ceramics that are coming from non-local ceramics that are found at, or non-cottonwood ceramics that are found at Cottonwood are from Elk Ridge. So we've got clear evidence of ceramic evidence of interaction that, and more so than we see with any other sites in the valley. Okay. So in addition to, I should just say, as part of that, the local community, you'll see all these sites here. These are so this is the Pit House Village, this is the big Pueblo, this is the pretty big Pueblo. But we've also got all these other sites around there. And most of them are field houses, not surprisingly. So 1 to 3 room Pueblos. We've got a few 10-room Pueblos that we think were probably used as, probably associated with the Elk Ridge community, but used as kind of marking the land. Okay, I'm on the East Fork, this is marking the land. I'm on the West Fork, this is marking the land. So we have this kind of really active, I think, active engaged community in the north end of the valley. So our next thing was, well, how did Elk Ridge is up here, how was it interacting with the rest of the valley? And one of the things you have to realize here is that Mimbres really it's developing at the same time that Chaco Canyon is in the north, very distinct identity. And we think that that is intentional, that they were trying to, we don't want anything that's going on up north. We don't see the violence that we see up north. We don't see any of that. And so they have very similar ceramics. They have very similar architecture. They have very similar ritual. So Elk Ridge was clearly part of that identity. And we see this through its ceramic exchange. Elk Ridge was a production center. That's why we have all the sourcing of ceramics that were being exchanged throughout the valley. We find abundant evidence of Elk Ridge pots. Daryl Creel has done a huge amount of INA work across the entire Mimbres region, tons and tons of Elk Ridge pots at these sites, even in the very south end of the valley. So we know that they were produced in ceramics, and that was probably a big part of their interaction. They were also raising turkeys. And we think that this was done not for food, but for the feathers, which were being feathers and maybe feather blankets, which were being traded south. Okay, so we found a turkey pen. You can see this basalt plug right here, this small room. This was in the Ramada, that Ramada area where we had evidence of the feasting. There was also a turkey pen there. At the south end, they found Pueblo rooms that were reused as turkey pens. We found 7 turkey burials, which is one of the reasons we know that they weren't being eaten because they were articulated. We've done the DNA on all those. They are all domesticated. The cool thing is we've done the DNA on the turkeys in the north end where we were digging. The south end, when they did the salvage work, they found a bunch of turkeys. Those are not, they're not all domesticated. So they're bringing in some non-domesticates, I guess, to keep the line going. But again, evidence that they were raising these not for their feathers, which would have been important in rituals and important in feather blankets. I know some little known thing. I don't know if you know that the spur of a turkey, you can age a turkey by measuring the spur of a turkey. I never knew that until I worked at Elk Ridge. So this is a 3-year-old turkey right there. So you can look at your turkey at Thanksgiving. You can impress all of your friends and family by saying, oh, look, this is a
random bits of knowledge.
So one of the coolest things for me is what we found in this set of rooms here. And it's the first time when we dug him. So in this room, this is one of our big rooms, okay? This is the one that was cut by the Royo that I said the doorway went into here, okay? I'm gonna talk primarily about these 2 rooms. But in room 113, when Katie was excavating the burial, and she pulled him out, and I said, that's not Mimbres. He looked very distinct, okay? He was tall, very tall, taller than most, more robust, and had a big prognathic face and occipital flattening in the back of his head. Well, he was buried with a smudged pot, okay? And smudging, which is this blackening of the interior, very, very distinct ceramic technique used by what we call the upland Magio in the reserve area. So here's the Mimbres Valley. That's the upland. So if you go up into the San Francisco Valley, up into the mountainous area, you get into what's referred to as the reserve area. And there are pueblos up there dating to the same time as the Classic period, very distinct architecture. Usually they have mealing bins, which we don't ever find in the Mimbres Valley. And very distinct smudged ceramics. A woman named Tammy Stone has done a lot of work showing that really this smudging technique is a identity marker, long-standing identity marker for upland Latino. So we have this guy with this smudge pot on him, and you could have ended it there, except for all the really cool stuff that happens at Elk Ridge after he is buried there. Okay, because in subsequent rooms, we start to see evidence that not just he was there, but that what we're inferring to be family members came in. And we see that for the first time, that's not a Mimbres wall. When we excavated it, we're like, whoa, look at this wall. We were so excited. nice, flat, tabular stones, super well made with, just for fun, typical Mimbres wall. So we were very excited when we were digging that room. That's room 118. 117 had also had it, but not, I mean, this was just perfect. The other thing we start to see is some ceramic design changes. All right. We start to see motifs that we don't see in the Mimbres area, but that are really, really common in the reserve area. And this is on household ceramics, not just the burial vessels. We see it on the household ceramics. So we start to see these changes with the movement in. He comes in here, and then we start to see all these rooms. So we had already determined before that this was an associated long-term extended family. And so we think he brought some family members with him, his line. And as a result of that, we see some definite changes in smudged and reserved corrugated vessels in domestic context, in household context. Again, they were just in burials. We might be saying, okay, you know, it's something they're just keeping their ancestry, but we find it in domestic context, okay? And almost 10% of our sherds are smudged. So our broken ceramics, 10% is huge. Everywhere else in the valley, 1% maybe. Okay, so we definitely, what we're inferring, and some of it, and again, I don't have time to go through all of this, but we've also got the INA data showing that these smudge wares are being made at Elk Ridge. And the vessels that have the reserve motifs are being made, so they're not just exchanged. Okay, they're being made right there. So our inference is that there are upland potters living at Elk Ridge during this time, which shows to us that these, it was a very flexible, much like you would guess from the, if you look at their architecture, very flexible organization, very flexible community. And so what we see is that usually in responses to intermarriage, if you look across the record, you see either they'll conform and they would have adopted Mimbres cultural practices, which they do to a degree. You still have potters making Mimbres wares. The architecture is still primarily cobble adobe, or just once in a while get some really nice walls built. And then you could shun the new practices and have two very distinct material cultures. We don't see that at all. So what we're seeing is that they're adopting new practices, but as these other family members move in, other kin from the upland move in, they're also introducing new ways of doing things, new motifs, new ways of making pottery. And so what that leaves us with the idea is that this, you know, we were trying to put like rigid boundaries on these communities. And at least with Elk Ridge, we don't see that. It was a very, what we think was a very dynamic and flexible. And I like that about Elk Ridge, is that they were, you know, it was tough making a living up in that northern area because you always had to worry about early frosts. And so, you know, we think they were hedging their bets by doing the exchange, but they were still very flexible and very little evidence. There's evidence, Katie did some work on the burials. There is evidence of violence, but it's primarily interpersonal violence, like somebody bumping somebody on the head, but no evidence of anywhere near the violence that we see in other areas of this. So I close with this very beautiful sunset, which is sad because we've had so many wildfires up there, but it makes for a beautiful sunset. So anyway, that's my Elk Ridge spiel. So I will answer any questions you might have.
Turkeys. I was really, first of all, just a comment aside, that was one small turkey pan. I was trying to picture them just like cramming them in there.
And the turkeys were big too. No, I don't think they were happy.
No, not So you mentioned that some were domesticated and some were not. How was that determined?
Sean Dolan did the DNA. We just
Oh,
sent
DNA.
it, yeah, he did DNA and isotopes. So, we know the diet, mostly they were corn fed, but yeah, he did DNA. So it was, yeah. And then believe it or not, they're turkey haplotypes that you can distinguish. But that was what was so cool, is that, ours were all domesticated, but it looks like they were bringing in wild ones too, to, I don't know, keep the bloodline strong, or I don't know. We don't know why. So,
When the previous landowner bulldozed the site, was that malicious?
oh yeah, there were, apparently, you saw that, the fence line, there were buyers, because of pots, there were buyers, apparently, we get all the landowners would stop by and talk to us and tell us stories. But apparently there were buyers lined up along that fence line bidding on the burial vessels as they came out. Now, it's interesting because Danny, my grad student, they, years and years later, the landowner, a guy named Croteau, his grandchildren came by the Mimbres Cultural Heritage Site, which is the place that now does most of the education stuff, and said, we have a bunch of ceramics. And so returned a bunch, not the only one of them was one really beautiful vessel of 2 people. But Danny did a lot of sourcing of those, as included those in her dissertation analysis. But a lot of them, who knows where they are? I mean, we don't. Sometimes we'll get like with cottonwood. We know a lot about cottonwood exchange and interaction because there was a looted collection, and the guy gave it to the Deming Museum. So sometimes the looted collections will come back, but usually with just site level. You might, if you're lucky, you get site level data. But that's a great question, because we don't know. We know that there were literally hundreds of burial vessels that were sold, but we only have one.
So the bulldozing was like speed up looting as quick as possible before.
Get to those, because they knew the burials were, most of the burials, not all, but most of the burials were underneath the Pueblo room floors. So apparently, and again, this is all from people, but some people had lived in the valley for decades, so they knew they were tunneling in. So they'd see the Pueblo room floor, and they literally, because it was so deeply buried, they tunnel in. So,
can you speak to, you introduced this idea of core lineage groups. When you're dealing with a structure that's just a number of rooms, how do you determine like how they're organizing themselves? Is it room by room, or how do you found this is the core lineage and these are extra communities drawn to them?
that's such a great question. And it's mostly through architecture, through bonding and abutting, and then the door. And that's why I kept stressing the changing in the doorways.
Yeah.
Because as these rooms would grow, they'd add a new doorway. So they'd start
Those are
with one
connected.
room, and then all of a sudden you'd see a doorway built, and then a vent that used to be a vent closed off because they had to build another room there. So it was all through that. I mean, we had, thank God for Daryl, because Daryl, very, very detailed evidence of bonding and abutting, and then superpositioning. So we could see the hearths being remodeled, and then the burials, of course. And the burials, you could tell the long-term burials because of the changes in ceramic styles. So yeah, but it was a lot of work. There were times when we were just like, what, I mean, Daryl, we have this one, I didn't put it in here, but we have this one wall where there were 3 building episodes in the one wall. And it was like, because what we finally determined was there was a Pueblo room underneath that they demolished when they built that room. And so little remnants of that wall were So, yeah.
Yeah, I don't envy you. I'm spoiled. So I have very nice architecture. So. A lot of your pictures, I was like, that looks like a dirt pit to me.
It'll make you feel better when I talk about shit what's
Okay.
On the back of our shirt, when, you know, the students would do shirts every year, they had no walls, no floors, no problem.
Yeah, at least we had walls. I mean, a lot of times they've fallen in and they have been remodeled, but at least we had walls.
If you were doing that level of analysis on the turkey, the male that was buried, were you allowed to do isotopic?
You know, it's so interesting.
Just based on physical characteristics.
And this is really interesting. It's just based on, that's why we're so vague on it,
Yeah.
because we can't, I mean, I would bet anything, but we can't prove it.
Okay.
We had, at the time we were digging him, we were at, and this is a good NAGPRA for you guys, okay, so the Mimbres have no known descendants. The closest genetically are the Tarahumara. So during the course of working at Harris and at Elk Ridge, we've gone back and forth with which tribe. So it was Acoma, then it was Sunni, Acoma, Zuni, Acoma. So now it's Acoma. And so it changes because based on the tribal council. So there's a new DNA technique that if you soak the tooth, you can get DNA from them. It's much less destructive, right? So we actually had, because afterwards, there are burials that we think might be his descendants. And so we actually had the teeth pulled. I mean, no, we didn't pull them, but they were, you know, they were loose. So we had a number of teeth, and we had permission from that tribal council. And right before we did it, tribal council changed. Oh, God. Yeah. And I mean, you know, I don't do this because it's the Forest Service, so it's in concert with me, Chris Adams. And I said, tell them that all we want to know is how they're related to each other, right? We don't care, because of course the concern is that you're going to show that they aren't, you know, and so we were like, we don't care about that. We just want to know if they're related to each other. But understandably, they were like, yeah, well, maybe she says that, but then the data are there. And how are you going to control that data? So we understood. I mean, obviously, but it would have been wonderful. Yes, that would solve that in a nanosecond. But yeah, so then the latest tribal, and they're with the burials. We excavated the ones that were, of course, endangered, and the burials and the burial goods are with the Forest Service now, and they've been working with the Acoma to rebury them, but they're not going to rebury them. They're going to rebury them somewhere in the Mimbres Valley, and that's the problem, right? That how are they going to protect them? So there's talk of reburying them at the ranger station where the rangers would be there, but the problem is that how are we going to? Because ideally you'd want to put them back at Elk Ridge. Well, I can guarantee you that they'd be gone, you know, in a couple weeks. So, because sadly, the market, especially in Europe, the market for Mimbres pottery is still strong. So here with NAGPRA, unfortunately, a lot of them have kill holes in them, in the base of them. So here, unfortunately, with NAGPRA, it's really cut back on the both the looting and the sale, but it's still of concern. So it shows you some of the complexities of, you know, you've got this ideal situation where you would return them to the site where they were found, but they, you know, and nobody can guarantee their safety.
And I know Danny has said too that she has, I think it's like an eBay alert whenever there's any Mimbres pot that goes up, so she can report it instantly. So
Yeah. So there's
something happening.
What was the population?
That's a great question. And we think that there were 2,200 rooms, not all occupied at the same time, obviously, you've got all these changes. So I hate to do population estimates, but I would say in the community, probably about 1,000 people. So a pretty large population, you know, and in that particular area, and then you go down the river. So it was probably quite up to 10,000 people in that area. Yeah.
What was like what would the river level have been like when all of these places were occupied?
And that's a great question because we're the just north of Elk Ridge, there's no longer surface water, but it would have been near the surface. But then as it goes south, you get more and more surface water. And so they've done all kinds of estimates that it would have been a pretty good moving river, but not so fast. And I'd have to look it up, the speed that it was a good river for doing irrigation. So it was slow enough and broad enough, kind of braided enough that you would do irrigation off of it. At least the main stem. Harder to do in the other forks of it, but certainly along the main stem. And that's why we think we see, if you saw that map of where the different pueblos were, we think that that's probably tied to irrigation systems and the control of a certain reach of the river. And it's not obviously the river as it goes down the Mimbres, it constricts and then it opens up and then it constricts. So you can basically kind of see where the pueblos are. My co-author on the paper we're working on did a bunch of work. Roger Anion did a bunch of work on looking at those systems in the south. He excavated at Galaz before they bulldozed it, so.
And is it so deeply buried that you can't detect the actual irrigation features?
No, and you know what, like, so at Harris, the landowner thought I was totally nuts. So Harris is right above this broad expanse, beautiful of floodplain. And so I went out there and I walked the entire floodplain, seeing if I could, because I know they were irrigating there. But there's been so much modern where they would want to irrigate. So do all the modern folks, right? So there's been so much change, but you could see the irrigation canals that the farmers use today. I'm sure they
Isn't that kind of typical in the Southwest where modern basically follows prehistoric irrigation?
And it's just like the road. I know that the road that goes up the Mimbres Valley was a trail. I mean, it had to be because it's the logical way you would get up.
Yeah, have you done any research into looking at the change of the landform where like the waterways are intersecting throughout time, like is to like figure out why Elk Ridge is so tucked in further into the valley compared to like more of the mouth, like especially like thinking about like the erosion and like deposition throughout time.
They've done some studies on flooding. And we know, actually, one of the rooms that we done was flooded. So we know flooding was an issue for them. And so we think that one of the reasons we think that they moved down there was because it wasn't taken away from irrigable land, which would have been the North Fork, but they didn't want to be way up above. They wanted to be down closer to the fields, essentially. And so we think that that's why, and the reason it's tucked back a little bit is because of the flooding. Because they would have been, and like I said, we still had flooded rooms, so they still experienced it. Okay, well, thank you guys.